Forget dragons, epic battles, and heroic last stands, because the real royal drama isn't about how these rulers lived, but how they spectacularly kicked the bucket. We're diving into the history book's darkest bloopers reel: princes crushed by furniture, emperors drowned in bathtubs, kings bested by monkeys, and legends erased like bad Wi-Fi signals. Ready to meet the royals who died so ridiculously, even their tombstones probably facepalm? Let's get into the juicy mess history doesn't want you to forget. Let's talk about King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, the monarch who turned dessert into a deadly sport. In February 1771, after what we can only assume was another taxing day of royal lounging, the king decided to reward himself with what history politely calls an enthusiastic dining experience, but what normal people would call a food crime scene. His final meal wasn't so much a dinner as a culinary obstacle course: lobster, caviar, champagne, and the pièce de résistance, 14 servings of semla, those innocent-looking Swedish buns that pack more cream than a royal dairy. Picture the scene: servants exchanging increasingly concerned glances as their king morphed into a one-man pastry demolition crew, his face becoming an abstract art piece of whipped cream and poor life choices. By midnight, His Majesty had graduated from pleasantly full to actively negotiating with God about digestive mercy. The court physicians, likely stifling both professional concern and inappropriate laughter, officially recorded the cause as digestive complications, history's most diplomatic way of saying this man was murdered by his own sweet tooth. What makes this particularly tragicomic is that Adolf Frederick wasn't some powerless peasant. He was a literal king who could have stopped at any time, yet chose to go out like a Viking at an all-you-can-eat buffet. His legacy? Proof that no amount of crown polish can make death by pastry sound regal. The real kicker? Swedes still joke about semla being the king's killer today, making Adolf Frederick the only monarch whose greatest historical contribution was becoming a cautionary tale about portion control. The tragicomic demise of King George II, when Majesty met mortality on the Privy Throne. On a bitterly ordinary October morning in 1760, as London shivered beneath grey skies perfectly suited to British melancholy, King George II, 77 years old, famously cantankerous, and stubborn enough to make his wig stand on end in protest, began his day with the same ironclad routine that had carried him through wars, political betrayals, and the abject horror of 18th century medicine. First, the ceremonial grumbling. Targets included the French, the weather, and whichever servant had misplaced his favorite snuff box. Next, the laborious wig settling, a 3-attendant operation requiring the precision of a siege engineer. And finally, the solemn procession to what court historians would later euphemistically term the private withdrawing chamber, but what was, in brutal honesty, a glorified wooden box with a hole cut in it, perched precariously over a porcelain receptacle that, despite its gilded edges, could not disguise its fundamental indignity. There, upon this throne of necessity, the last British monarch to lead troops into battle, Dettingen, 1743 if you're keeping score, settled in for what should have been a routine constitutional, unaware that his aorta, weary from decades of royal temper tantrums and Hanoverian stubbornness, had quietly scheduled its resignation. What happened next was neither heroic nor dignified, a sudden, catastrophic pop of circulatory rebellion, and Britain's mighty ruler slumped forward like a marionette with its strings cut, his breeches still unbuttoned around his ankles, his face frozen in an expression that blended royal displeasure with what can only be described as, "Oh, for God's sake, really," leaving the servant who eventually dared and interrupt to bear witness to a scene of such brutal humility that it would haunt court gossip for generations. A king brought low not by war or assassination, but by his own biology's impeccable comedic timing. The physicians arrived with their usual arsenal of leeches and smelling salts, but even they couldn't spin this one. Official records would claim His Majesty passed peacefully in his private apartments, but the truth echoed through the palace halls with the subtlety of a musket shot. George II had died on the toilet, proving once and for all that no amount of crown jewels or divine right can spare a man from mortality's most universal punchline. And thus, the monarch who had once rallied troops with saber in hand entered history not for battles won or laws passed, but for delivering the most humbling moral of all. When nature calls, even kings must answer, and sometimes the call comes collect the queen who outlived her own story. Because when history tries to write you off, sometimes you just keep living out of sheer spite and fabulous hats. Enter Queen Elizabeth I, England's flame-haired, sharp-tongued icon, who basically looked at the chaos of the 16th century and said, "Hold my ruff." She wasn't supposed to be queen. Daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, aka the wife he had beheaded for not producing a male heir, Elizabeth started life on the royal roster labeled as "Oops, wrong gender." She was declared illegitimate, shoved out of the line of succession, and basically filed under spare ginger in case of emergencies. But England being England, full of drama and poorly timed deaths, somehow left her as the last Tudor standing. And when her turn came, she didn't just take the throne, she stole the whole show. Elizabeth Erlakren ruled for 44 years, which in Tudor time is like surviving 900 Game of Thrones seasons without dying of poison, plague, or terrible marriage choices. She dodged assassination plots like they were mildly annoying weather updates. Catholics wanted her dead. Foreign powers wanted her married. Her advisors wanted her to settle down and have a baby. But Elizabeth had a better plan. Stay single, rule everything, and look fabulous while doing it. She styled herself the Virgin Queen, which was less about actual virginity and more about giving patriarchy the middle finger with a diamond-studded glove. Her court was a mix of power, poetry, and people constantly trying and failing to outmaneuver her. Spoiler, they didn't. And let's not forget the Spanish Armada. You know, that whole thing where the biggest fleet in Europe tried to invade England and Elizabeth casually rallied her troops while dressed like a battlefield Beyoncé, delivering one of history's most savage pep talks. I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. Cue thunder, cue drama. Cue Spain losing half its ships. By the end of her life, Elizabeth had turned what should have been a royal footnote into a global legend. But here's the kicker, she kept living. Long after her friends, enemies, suitors, and conspirators had all died off or faded away, Elizabeth just kept going, powered by willpower and possibly spite. Even as her hair turned fake, her teeth fell out, and her face got so powdered it could blind diplomats, she refused to give up the crown or the spotlight. The myth outgrew the woman, and the woman outlived the myth. So here lies Queen Elizabeth I, except not really, because she never truly left. When you rule with style, sass, and sovereign pettiness, sometimes death has to wait its turn. The Viking who was murdered by his own trophy, a darkly comic saga of bacterial vengeance. In the unforgiving world of 9th century Orkney, where power was measured in axe strokes and reputation was written in bloodstains, Sigurd the Mighty, a warlord whose very name made grown warriors check their sword belts twice, was about to learn the hardest lesson of his brutal career. Never underestimate a dead man's dental hygiene. Fresh from butchering his rival Mael Brigte in a battle that should have been his crowning glory, Sigurd made the fatal mistake of treating human anatomy like a trophy rack, tying the Scottish chieftain's severed head to his saddle with all the ceremony of a shopper hanging groceries on his horse. What began as a standard issue Viking flex, look upon my spoils of war and despair, quickly devolved into history's most grotesque case of biological warfare, as Brigte's corpse teeth, still packed with enough bacteria to wipe out a small village, began their microscopic invasion of Sigurd's bloodstream through what started as a "'tis but a scratch" moment and ended as the ultimate example of workplace hazards for medieval warlords. As Sigurd rode triumphantly home, the decapitated heads bounced merrily against his leg like the world's worst saddlebag, its teeth, nature's original bioweapons, finding purchase in his skin with each jostling step. The infection that followed was the universe's perfect punchline. A man who'd spent his life fearing neither man nor God, brought low by something he couldn't even see, his mighty Viking constitution, no match for the microbial uprising brewing in his veins. Within days, the warrior who'd laughed in the face of battle axes was reduced to a feverish wreck, his body staging the mutiny to end all mutinies as Brigte's posthumous revenge transformed from theoretical possibility to septic reality. The final irony? Sigurd, who'd built his reputation on being smarter and more vicious than his opponents, was ultimately outmaneuvered by a corpse's dental plaque, proving that in the Game of Thrones, sometimes the real weapons are the friends and bacteria we make along the way. The prince who was executed by furniture. Because sometimes royal punishment comes with a lid. Ah, monarchy. That magical system where your dad can give you a castle for your birthday or stuff you into a box and leave you to rot. Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbingly creative executions in history. Forget guillotines and poisoned wine. No. Korea in the 18th century said, let's try something domestic. Our unfortunate main character, Crown Prince Sado of the Joseon dynasty Korea, born into privilege, groomed for greatness, died inside a giant wooden rice box like some cursed leftovers. Let's set the scene. It's the year 1762, it's July, and it's hot enough to deep fry an ox in the courtyard. Prince Sado, the heir to the throne, is not having a good time. To be fair, neither is anyone around him. Why? Because by all accounts, Prince Sado was a walking HR violation. We're talking unpredictable behavior, paranoia, and occasional murdery vibes. Rumor has it he'd just randomly kill people in the palace, servants, eunuchs, clothes, you name it, he'd rage at it. His closet was apparently full of robes he couldn't wear anymore because they were looking at him funny. Mental illness? Most likely. Therapy ? Unavailable. Emotional support rice chest? Ironically, yes. But here's the dilemma. Sado was still the crown prince. You can't just decapitate the heir without starting a cosmic PR disaster. Enter King Yongjo, Sado's dad, a man who clearly opened a parenting book, read the first sentence, panicked, and decided on murder light. Instead of straight-up execution, because filicide looks bad on royal resumes, the king did what every conflicted father would do. He ordered his son sealed inside a giant wooden rice chest. Yes, like the ones you store grain in. But this one came with air holes, not for mercy, just to make the suffering take longer. Sado, the royal heir, was locked inside the box in the sweltering summer heat, left in a corner like some cursed IKEA project gone wrong. And there he remained, for 8 long, hot, airless, rice-scented days. 8 days of silence, sweat, and existential dread. You know, like camping, but with more royal trauma. By the time they opened the box, Sado was no longer a prince. He was, let's say, emotionally and physically decomposed. Official cause of death, storage-related complications. Now, the palace didn't exactly throw a parade. They tried to cover it up, of course. Oh, he just passed away mysteriously. Mysteriously? He was marinated in timber and despair, not exactly subtle. And let's talk about the aftermath. His son, Jongjo, who somehow survived the family drama without being boxed, would later become king and quietly try to rehab his dad's legacy, which, to be fair, is hard when the entire kingdom knows your dad died like expired pantry goods. The emperor who laughed himself to death, because sometimes the joke really does kill. King Martin of Aragon, Spain, 1410. Full belly, royal robe, and lying in bed like a man who'd just demolished an entire medieval buffet. He wasn't ill, just impressively, almost professionally stuffed with food and wine. Basically, the medieval version of, I shouldn't have eaten that 5th turkey leg, but here we are. He asked for his court jester, because nothing pairs with extreme bloating like a little comedy. The jester arrived late as usual, prompting the king to ask what took him so long. And then came the joke, the historic, fatal, actually on-record joke. Sorry, Your Majesty. I saw a young deer hanging by its tail from a fig tree. Looked like someone was punishing it for stealing figs. That was it. That was the line. And Martin lost his royal mind. He started laughing, not a chuckle, not a regal ha-ha. No, this was unhinged, table-slapping, can't breathe, medieval wheezing. He laughed so hard that his own dinner revolted. Combined with his already overworked digestive system, the laughter caused a fatal combination of indigestion, choking, and what physicians politely described as not breathing anymore. Yes, King Martin of Aragon laughed himself to death over a fig joke. A deer, a fig tree, boom, dead monarch. The jester, to his credit, instantly became both the funniest and most dangerous man in the kingdom. No sword, no poison, just one killer punchline. And the best part, there was no war, no coup, no shadowy backroom plot. Just a king, a meal, a dumb joke, and one very enthusiastic laugh. The Royal Chronicles didn't even try to dress it up. They straight up said, he died from laughter and indigestion. That's it. That's how Spain lost a king. So next time someone says laughter is the best medicine, remember, not if you've just eaten half a boar and your intestines are being held together by sheer willpower. For King Martin, the joke didn't just land, it buried him. Medieval monarchs, rich in gold, poor in gastrointestinal restraint. The ruler who poisoned himself with immortality. Because nothing says long life like dying early from your own eternal life juice. Qin Shi Huang, first emperor of China, unifier of kingdoms, builder of the Great Wall, and apparently a man who looked at death and said, "Nah, I'm too rich for that." He ruled in the 3rd century BCE and had everything: palaces, power, and an army of literal terracotta statues waiting to protect him in the afterlife, like an ancient Funko Pop collection. But for Qin Shi Huang, this whole afterlife thing was Plan B. Plan A, never die at all. So he did what any overachieving megalomaniac with unlimited power would do. He became obsessed with immortality. Not metaphorically, like leaving behind a legacy, but literally, chemically. Find me the potion that makes me unkillable immortality. Spoiler alert, it did not go well. His alchemists, who were basically medieval hype men with beards, told him the secret to eternal life was mercury. Yes, mercury. The shiny toxic stuff inside old thermometers. The element that makes modern scientists go, "Don't touch that unless you want to grow extra toes." And the emperor said, "Fantastic. Bottle it. I'll take 10. Qin Shi Huang began consuming pills, potions, and elixirs, all spiked with mercury and other heavy metals, because apparently nothing says forever young, like slowly pickling your insides in poison. His physicians, either completely insane or just really committed to keeping their heads attached, convinced him this bubbling metallic cocktail would make him immortal. What it did instead: massive organ failure, hallucinations, and possibly the worst case of ironic death in history. The man who tried to cheat death by eating metal died in his 40s, probably babbling nonsense and glowing like a cursed Christmas ornament. But wait, it gets better. Because the emperor's obsession didn't stop at chugging poison smoothies. He also sent out expeditions, actual fleets of ships, to go find the mythical islands of the immortals, where eternal life supposedly came with ocean views. One of these expeditions allegedly ghosted the empire and never came back. Probably because they realized, hey, we could die here drinking mercury, or live over there with no emperor. Let's choose beach retirement. So let's review: obsessed with living forever, trusted ancient quacks with zero science and a death wish, drank metal like it was a health smoothie, died painfully while trying to become immortal. Qin Shi Huang didn't just die, he outplayed himself. His story is the historical equivalent of buying a fireproof house and setting it ablaze to test it. The man who built China's first empire commissioned one of the most awe-inspiring tombs in world history and ruled with an iron fist, literally poisoned himself, trying to avoid the one thing no ruler has ever conquered: death. So next time you're tempted by a sketchy ad that says, "Live forever with this one weird trick," just remember Emperor Qin Shi Huang, and maybe don't drink anything that glows. History, where immortality is fatal and irony is undefeated. The Pope who died as he lived, scandalously. Because when you're God's representative on earth, why not also be the drama? If you think being Pope means living a life of quiet prayer, humility, and mild Gregorian chanting, meet Pope Alexander VI, the man who said, "Holiness is fine, but have you tried orgies and political bribery?" Born as Rodrigo Borgia, This guy came from the Borgia family, a clan so morally flexible they could have been made of wet spaghetti. He climbed the holy ladder, not with piety or spiritual wisdom, but with raw cash, connections, and the ability to throw a killer party without spilling his wine. He literally bought votes to become pope. And once he got the job, he treated the Vatican like his own personal soap opera set. Let's talk highlights. He had mistresses, not one, not two. We're talking entire departments of mistresses. He had children, as pope, which you know is technically against the rules. But he didn't care. He openly acknowledged them, hosted elaborate ceremonies for them, and gave them land, titles, and influence. Most famously, Cesare Borgia, his son, and Lucrezia Borgia, his daughter, who were so tangled in rumors of poison, incest, and murder that it's hard to tell where history ends and HBO begins. And don't even get started on the banquet of chestnuts. Allegedly, one of the wildest Vatican parties in history. According to reports, which read more like ancient TMZ, dozens of courtesans, candles, wine, and, well, chestnuts were involved. Let's just say they weren't roasting them on an open fire. They were using them for competitive entertainment. If you know, you know. Now you might be wondering, how does a pope like this die? Exactly as you'd expect. In 1503, Pope Alexander VI died after a dinner that some say was poisoned, either by enemies or, hilariously, by accident, because he mixed up the poisoned wine meant for someone else. That's right. He may have poisoned himself with his own hit job. Other historians suggest it wasn't poison, just malaria or heat stroke, because Rome in August is like being microwaved in sin. Either way, he died bloated, feverish, and soaked in scandal. His body decomposed so fast and so badly that the people guarding it reportedly ran away in horror. Like his physical remains were just as over the top as his lifestyle. And when it came time to bury him, no crowds, no mourning, just a rushed, unceremonious funeral, shoved into a tomb like the Vatican was trying to erase the browser history of the last 11 years. So what did we learn? Being pope doesn't stop you from acting like a medieval rock star. If you're going to run the church like a crime family, maybe double-check the poison bottle first. And most importantly, dying scandalously is one thing, but dying so scandalously that even your corpse is a PR disaster, that's legacy. Pope Alexander VI, the only man to make the papacy look like a season of Real Housewives of Renaissance Rome, because sometimes the holiest job on earth comes with the most unholy receipts. Now the king who lost a fight to a monkey, because nothing says divine right to rule like getting smacked down by a banana enthusiast. Let's rewind to the 19th century, Burma, now known as Myanmar, a land of ancient temples, royal elephants, and apparently a monkey with a serious vendetta. Our unlucky monarch for today is King Thibaw Min, the last king of Burma, and arguably the first royal to be dethroned by both the British Empire and a primate with boundary issues. Now Thibaw didn't exactly have a stress-free job. He inherited the throne in 1878 at age 19, was constantly dealing with court intrigue, British colonial pressure, and a palace full of people who'd probably poison him for a better seat at dinner. The usual king stuff. But none of that prepared him for the monkey incident. You see, Burmese royals kept pet monkeys in the palace because nothing screams, "I'm in charge," like living with a bunch of hairy goblins who throw fruit at your face. One day, for reasons lost to history, but probably involving stolen snacks or eye contact, a royal monkey went feral and attacked King Thebaw. Let me say that again. The king was attacked by a monkey, and not just any monkey. This one was reportedly well-fed, deeply unhinged, and suspiciously good at hand-to-hand combat. It launched itself at the king's face like a caffeinated demon, scratching, biting, and absolutely ruining his regal vibe. Did the guards help? Not really. The whole palace was apparently so stunned by the fact that His Majesty was being full-on eat by a monkey, they just stood there. Legend says one servant tried to help and got bitten too, which only made things worse. The king left with scratches, bruises, and a permanently bruised ego. Because let's be honest, you can survive colonialism, but you never live down getting wrecked by a monkey in front of your royal court. And here's the kicker. Within just a few years of this primate beatdown, King Thebaw was exiled by the British. His monarchy collapsed, the throne gone, the palace taken. Was the monkey secretly working for the empire? We'll never know. But let's just say the timing is suspicious. So what do we take away from this royal monkeypocalypse? Never trust a monkey with palace access. Guards who freeze during a monkey ambush are not your real friends. And most importantly, if you lose a fight to a monkey, history will remember. King Thebaw may have lost his kingdom to British colonizers, but he lost his dignity to a coconut-sized chaos goblin in fur. History, where the fall of empires sometimes starts with a banana and ends with a monkey slap. The king who spontaneously combusted, almost. Because why wait for your enemies when you can almost set yourself on fire? Meet King Charles II of England, the party king, the lover of fine clothes, and apparently the human embodiment of too hot to handle. Now, Charles wasn't just any monarch. He was the guy who thought candles, smoking pipes, and extravagant silk robes made for the perfect combo. Spoiler alert, they do not. One fateful evening, Charles was doing what any self-respecting 17th century king does, lounging in a dimly lit room surrounded by flickering candles, puffing away on his pipe like a chimney on steroids. Because nothing says royal sophistication like filling your palace with enough smoke to choke a dragon. Then disaster struck. A stray spark from his pipe, or maybe a rebellious candle flame, decided to say hello by landing on his glorious velvet robes. In an instant, the king went from His Majesty to his majestically on fire. Flames started licking at his royal behind like a bad bonfire, turning what should have been a cozy night into a full-on fire drill. Now you'd think the royal guards would jump in like medieval firefighters, but nope, they froze. Maybe they thought the king was part of some new avant-garde performance art, or maybe they just didn't want to be the ones who messed up the king's hair. Meanwhile, the king was probably flailing like a man possessed, trying to pat himself out with all the grace of a cat on a hot tin roof. Thankfully, the ever-resourceful servants rushed in with blankets and buckets of water, smothering the flames before Charles could become a cautionary tale in how not to be a human torch. He survived, robes scorched, but ego only slightly singed. But this wasn't just a royal wardrobe malfunction. It was classic Charles, a guy who partied so hard and ignored so many rules that it was only a matter of time before the fire department showed up uninvited. The Viking who was backstabbed from below. Because when you think you're the biggest, baddest warrior, turns out the biggest threat is your own throne. Meet King Harald Hardrada, the Viking legend with a name that sounds like a bad metal band and a reputation for being about as subtle as a wrecking ball. This guy lived for battle, glory, and probably shouting something that roughly translates to for Odin while swinging an axe the size of a small car. But here's the kicker. After years of conquering and pillaging, Harald wasn't taken down by an enemy on the battlefield. Nope. He got betrayed the classic Viking way, with a dagger where it hurts most. Except this dagger came from a place you don't usually expect, below his royal throne. The story goes that Harald was chilling in his palace, probably nursing a horn of mead and thinking about how awesome it was to be a Viking king, when some sneaky courtier decided it was time for a little political rearranging. This wasn't a grand battle or a heroic duel. This was pure, unadulterated backstabbing, literally. Legend says Harald was stabbed in the gut while sitting on his throne, like that moment when you're trying to feel regal and important, and suddenly someone decides to turn your royal seat into a stabbing station? Yeah, that happened. Talk about a brutal surprise attack. 1 second, you're king of the Norse world. The next, you're clutching your guts, wondering if you should have trusted that guy with a suspiciously sharp dagger hanging around his waist. And let's be honest, getting stabbed while sitting down, that's gotta sting on the ego more than the body. The guy who survived countless wars and ship battles gets taken out in his own throne room by someone who clearly thought, nah, let's do this quietly and with zero honor. Harald Hardrada's death was less Viking warrior dies gloriously in battle, and more Viking king gets gutted mid-sit. No dramatic last words, just a big ow. Emperor Valerian, ruler of Rome, conqueror of lands, wearer of togas, and occasional bath enthusiast. Now, most Roman emperors went out in dramatic fashion, stabbed by senators, poisoned by their wives, assassinated by their own guards. The classics. But Valerian? Oh, Valerian said, let's spice things up with water. There are conflicting reports, because ancient historians were basically the gossip bloggers of their day, but one version of Valerian's spectacular demise goes something like this. After a rather unimpressive reign full of military disasters and one very humiliating capture by the Persian king Shapur I, Valerian was imprisoned and turned into a royal footstool. Yes, a literal human ottoman. Empire status, downgraded. But that's not the story we're here for. The juicier tale, possibly invented, possibly true, almost certainly ridiculous, says Valerian met his end in a bathtub, alone, in captivity, naked, drowning. Apparently, the former emperor was either too old, too weak, or just too fed up to get out, and with no one rushing to help their favorite Roman rug, he slipped beneath the bubbles and into historical mystery. Just imagine, one moment you're an emperor, the next you're floating face down like a bloated Caesar salad. Now, did he actually drown in his bath? Or was he flayed alive, stuffed and displayed like a gruesome trophy, as other sources claim? Who knows? Ancient Rome wasn't exactly known for subtlety or consistency, but the fact that death by bubble bath is even on the list of possibilities tells you everything you need to know about Valerian's luck. The man went from ruling an empire to dying like an elderly grandpa in a safety hazard PSA. So whether he slipped, soaked too long, or just gave up mid-soak, Valerian's watery exit remains one of history's greatest maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, but still kind of funny endings. And somewhere, a Roman historian probably thought, yup, That'll make a great footnote. Now take a deep breath, because we are talking about the pharaoh who looked like he got mummified by a sledgehammer. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Pharaoh Seqenenre-Tao, the Egyptian king who apparently skipped the whole die peacefully phase and jumped straight to, let's test how many times a skull can be dented before it stops being a skull. Seqenenre lived during Egypt's I'm tired of invaders period, when a bunch of foreign kings called the Hyksos were crashing the pharaonic party. Naturally, he did what any good pharaoh would do, marched into war with fire in his eyes and probably a snake on his crown. But instead of a glorious battlefield death, Seqenenre got himself what can only be described as history's angriest facial makeover. When modern archaeologists unwrapped his mummy, they didn't find a peaceful king lying in state. Oh no. They found a royal face that had clearly been used as a training dummy for medieval weaponry. Axe wounds, sword slashes, blunt force trauma. Basically, every item in the ancient murder starter pack had a turn. There were no signs he fought back, no defensive wounds, no broken arms, no struggle. Just a pharaoh who looked like he insulted a gang of Hyksos blacksmiths and didn't live to regret it. One theory says he was captured and executed execution style, possibly while tied up like a pharaonic piñata. But here's the real kicker. After getting turned into royal hamburger meat, his embalmers still went ahead and mummified him. Yup, wrapped him right up, broken face and all, shoved him in a coffin, and shipped him off to the afterlife like everything was totally normal. So while other pharaohs were sipping wine and petting cats on their deathbeds, Seqenenre was out there being brutally pre-mummified by foreign invaders. Talk about skipping steps. This wasn't just a royal death. This was a pharaoh who got so violently wrecked, he basically arrived at the embalmer's table, already halfway done, ancient Egypt, where kings ruled with divine authority, until someone took a war club to their divine skull. Meet Sultan Bayezid I, ruler of the Ottoman Empire, a man so powerful, so terrifying, and so incredibly extra, he was nicknamed Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. Not because he was fast, mind you, but because his temper had the subtlety of a lightning strike in a fireworks factory. Bayezid didn't mess around. He expanded the empire like he was playing Risk on God mode, built palaces like they were going out of style, and strutted around as if gravity itself worked for him. But then, along came someone with even more extra, Timur the Lame, a Central Asian warlord with a limp, a grudge, and enough attitude to make Genghis Khan look like a camp counselor. The two locked horns at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, and spoiler alert, it did not go well for Bayezid. In one of the most awkward plot twists in imperial history, Sultan Thunderbolt was not only captured, he was stuffed into an iron cage, like an angry royal hamster. That's right. The man who once commanded armies with a glare was now being carted around like a very grumpy piece of luggage. And if that wasn't humiliating enough, legend has it that Bayezid, overwhelmed by defeat and possibly the sheer weight of his own shame, died inside that cage, either from illness, stress, or quite literally being crushed by the ornate gilded contraption he was locked in. Death by deluxe cage. How poetic. Just imagine the scene, a once mighty sultan, surrounded by velvet cushions, gold trim, and the echoes of his own bad decisions, slowly realizing that absolute power might actually come with physical consequences. There are different versions of the tale, of course. Some say he died of depression, others say he went on a hunger strike, and a few whisper that Timur treated him like a particularly annoying pet. But all the best stories agree on one thing. His power didn't just go to his head, it came crashing down on top of him. Sultan Bayezid I, bold conqueror, fierce ruler, and the man who proved that sometimes the throne doesn't kill you, the cage does. Enter Elizabeth Bathory, the Hungarian noblewoman, countess, and alleged vampire queen of the 16th century. Yes, that Elizabeth Bathory, the woman who put the extra in extremely unsettling aristocrat and apparently took skincare tips from Satan. Now most nobles spent their time hunting, politicking, or building fountains shaped like lions. Elizabeth? She was allegedly bathing in the blood of virgins to stay youthful. Normal anti-aging routines. Legend has it, one day a servant girl accidentally pulled her hair or wrinkled her dress or blinked wrong, and Elizabeth slapped her so hard she drew blood. When that blood landed on her skin, the countess looked at it and went, is that glow? And thus began the worst spa trend in European history. After that, things got very murdery, very fast. Reports say she lured peasant girls to her castle with promises of work, then turned her dungeon into a nightmare factory, complete with torture, bloodletting, and what we can only assume was the worst Yelp rating of all time. Estimates of her victim count range from dozens to hundreds. Honestly, at some point, even Dracula would have said, "Girl, chill." But here's the twist. Some historians think it might have all been a massive political takedown. Like maybe she was guilty of being rich, powerful, and terrifyingly single in a world full of fragile male egos. And what better way to bring a woman down than accusing her of drinking the blood of teenagers, like some kind of Elizabethan goth monster? Eventually, the Habsburgs got tired of her horror house vibes and locked her in a tiny room inside her own castle where she was bricked in alone for years. Like Rapunzel, but with way more guilt and way less hair. Did she really kill all those girls? Or was she just the unlucky recipient of medieval PR warfare? Hard to say. But one thing's for sure, Elizabeth Bathory became so infamous that she outlived her own life. Because nothing says legacy like being remembered as the queen who made people say, "Hey, you heard about the lady who bathed in blood?" Centuries later, move over fairy tales. This one's already soaked in red, the prince who drowned in wine. Because if you're going to go out, might as well do it marinated. We're talking about the prince who looked at a barrel of wine and said, "Yes, this shall be both my hobby and my coffin." Introducing Prince Wenceslaus of Bohemia, not to be confused with Good King Wenceslas, the carol guy who brought peas and warmth or whatever. No, this is the other Wenceslaus, the one whose idea of statecraft involved more goblets than laws, and whose liver probably filed for resignation years before he did. Wenceslaus didn't just enjoy wine, he made it his whole personality. This was a man who likely skipped water entirely and referred to grape juice as wine's disappointing cousin. So naturally, his death had to be spectacularly on brand. According to legend, the man got so monumentally drunk one evening that he stumbled into a vat of wine and stayed there. Whether he passed out, slipped, or just thought the wine barrel looked like a cozy nap spot is unclear. What is clear is that he drowned in wine, a death so ridiculous, even Bacchus would raise an eyebrow. It's the kind of royal ending that makes historians double-check their sources and then go, "Yeah, that tracks." And let's not forget, This was wine storage, not some luxury spa. That vat was probably sticky, smelly, and full of questionable floaties. But Wenceslaus? He went out like a sommelier on a mission that ended in total, undignified, grape-scented doom. And here's the disturbing thought. Someone definitely kept drinking from that barrel afterward. Waste not, want not, medieval edition. So raise a glass, carefully, to Prince Wenceslaus, the only man in history to die both for wine and in wine. His legacy? A cautionary tale that says, yes, you can love something too much, especially if it's alcoholic and stored in bulk. The Tsar who forgot to duck, because absolute power means never having to say, incoming. We're talking about Tsar Paul I of Russia, a man who managed to rule an empire and still missed the very obvious signs that everyone around him hated his guts. Paul was, let's say, difficult. He took the throne after his mother, Catherine the Great, and immediately launched a personal campaign to undo everything she did, as if ruling Russia was just a really spiteful group project. He changed military uniforms because he didn't like the color. He made weird laws about how nobles could dress. He even tried to tell people how to salute correctly. Basically, he was one powdered wig away from being a micromanaging disaster with a crown. Now, being an unpopular czar in Russia isn't exactly a long-term career. And Paul? He was deeply unpopular. Like entire court plotting your demise while sipping tea and pretending to be interested in your speeches. Unpopular. One night in 1801, a group of noblemen, who were very done with Paul's nonsense, decided they'd had enough. They broke into his bedroom, confronted him, and gave him one last chance to abdicate peacefully. Paul, being Paul, said something along the lines of, "How dare you?" or "I am your czar," or "Do you know who I am?" Classic pre-assassination dialogue. And then, he didn't duck. One of the assassins hit him with a heavy snuff box. Yes, a snuff box. That's a small container for powdered tobacco, which apparently doubles as a blunt force weapon in a pinch. After that, the rest of the conspirators joined in with a level of enthusiasm that screamed, "This has been building up for years." Tsar Paul died right there, on the floor of his own palace, in his pajamas, under a pile of nobles who really didn't want to hear him talk about uniform regulations one more time. He ruled Russia for just 5 years. He died because he ignored every red flag in his court and also, quite literally, forgot to duck. So the next time someone says, "Heavy is the head that wears the crown," just remember, sometimes it's not the crown that gets you. Sometimes it's a flying snuff box to the face, the emperor who choked on his own spectacle. Because sometimes, when you're all about the drama bites back. We're talking about Emperor Valentinian I, a Roman ruler who met his end not in battle, not in betrayal, not even by plague, but by rage, pure, full-throttle, vein-popping anger. Basically, history's most lethal temper tantrum. Valentinian was known for being tough, no nonsense, and about as cuddly as a cactus made of iron. He ruled the Western Roman Empire in the 4th century and treated diplomacy like a wrestling match. No subtlety, just intensity. One fine day in 375 CE, he sat down for a meeting with some barbarian envoys. These guys were there to negotiate, but they must have said something. Maybe they insulted Rome. Maybe they questioned his authority. Or maybe they just looked at him funny, because Valentinian lost it, and not your average political stern word and a frown kind of lost it. No, This was full-blown, red-faced, frothing fury. He leapt to his feet, started screaming so hard the messengers probably thought he was summoning a demon, and raged with such terrifying volume that his own body just said, nope. That's right. The Emperor's blood pressure skyrocketed, his heart tapped out, and mid-rant, he dropped dead. In front of the entire room, mid-performance, it was the Roman imperial version of dying in the middle of your mic drop. Historians say he burst a blood vessel in his brain, which is science's polite way of saying this dude literally choked on his own rage-fueled theatrics. The envoys, by the way, probably stood there frozen, wondering if this was an elaborate intimidation tactic, or if they should quietly back out of the room before someone blamed them for triggering Emperor Volcano. Valentinian I, man, myth, meltdown. He ruled with an iron fist and left the world in the middle of a full-volume tantrum. The king who was killed by his own hobby. Because nothing says monarch like inventing your own death trap and climbing right into it. Let's talk about King Alexander of Greece, a young ruler who didn't fall in battle, wasn't overthrown, and didn't die of royal boredom. No, this guy got taken out by monkeys. Yes, monkeys. Specifically as a result of his very outdoorsy little hobby. Alexander, poor guy, was just 27 years old and trying his best to look kingly while Europe fell apart around him. But unlike most rulers of the early 20th century, his biggest threat didn't come from political rivals or revolutionaries. It came from a leisurely stroll and an extremely bad choice of pet. One fine afternoon in 1920, the king decided to go for a walk in the royal gardens. Just him, his dog, and 0 bodyguards, because apparently royal safety was optional that day. Enter a pair of angry monkeys. Yes, monkeys that were being kept as pets in the palace, because what's a royal household without a couple of unpredictable primates running around, right? One of the monkeys decided it didn't like Alexander's dog and attacked it. Alexander, trying to be a good dog dad, jumped in to break up the fight. The other monkey, because of course there was a second monkey, jumped on him and bit him hard. The result? A series of infected wounds that doctors, in true early 20th century style, somehow made worse. No antibiotics, no vaccines, just lots of royal suffering and an infection that eventually killed him. The newspapers tried really hard to downplay the whole death by monkey thing, probably because it's a bit hard to look regal when your downfall sounds like a rejected Disney plot. But the truth was out, and Alexander's royal reign ended not in glory, but in a bite-sized tragedy courtesy of the animal kingdom, the conqueror who was conquered by a coffin. Because death, apparently, has a sense of irony and a wicked sense of humor. Let's talk about Tamerlane the Great, also known as Tamerlane, a man so feared, so bloodthirsty, and so into world domination that even Genghis Khan probably side-eyed him like, dude, chill. Tamerlane spent the late 14th century turning entire cities into smoking craters, stacking skulls into decorative towers, and writing his name into the Do Not Invite to Dinner section of every ruler's guest list. The man conquered Central Asia, Persia, the Middle East, and a decent chunk of India. His hobby was war. His love language was destruction. And his retirement plan was probably just die undefeated. But here's where it gets hilarious. The same guy who left a trail of ruin across continents got conquered by a coffin. His own. See, Tamerlane was buried in a fancy tomb in Samarkand, and because he was extra even in death, he had a curse inscribed on it. Something along the lines of, "Whosoever disturbs my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." Classic villain energy, 10 out of 10 dramatics. Fast forward to June 1941. Soviet archaeologists, in a move that can only be described as historically suicidal, decided to crack open Tamerlane's tomb. Despite elderly locals warning them not to mess with death furniture, the Soviets went ahead and opened it anyway. And 2 days later, 2 days, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Coincidence? Probably. Spooky? Oh, absolutely. Hilarious in a history is a chaotic mess kind of way. Definitely. Panicked and probably sweating vodka, the Soviets rushed to put Tamerlane back in the ground with full Islamic rites. And wouldn't you know it, shortly after, the Nazis started losing. Was it the tide of war, superior Soviet strategy, or the wrath of a very dead warlord who just wanted to be left alone in his death nap? Who's to say? So yes, Tamerlane, destroyer of cities, killer of kings, stacker of skulls, ended up being bossed around by his own corpse. Death didn't just come for him, it came with receipts, a sense of humor, and a shovel. Long story short, never mess with someone who's dramatic enough to curse their own coffin, especially if they used to collect empires like trading cards. The Sultan, who was outlived by his legend, because dying is temporary, but dramatic overachievement is forever. Enter stage left, Suleiman the Magnificent. And yes, Magnificent was not just a nickname, it was a full-time vibe. This guy ruled the Ottoman Empire at its absolute peak, with a crown, a harem, and an empire so huge, his cartographers probably cried themselves to sleep every night. He had palaces, poets, naval fleets, and enough bling to make Louis XIV look like a minimalist. The man redefined multitasking, conquering Europe before breakfast, reforming laws before lunch, and writing steamy love poetry to his wife before dinner. He wasn't just the Sultan, he was a one-man empire-building machine. But then, at the sprightly age of 71, basically 147 in medieval ruler years, Suleiman decided to go to war, again. Because nothing says aging gracefully like dragging your royal bones across half of Europe to lay siege to Sigedvar, a Hungarian fortress most people still can't pronounce. And here's where it gets weird. Suleiman died during the siege, natural causes to be fair, but his army was so obsessed with keeping morale up and, not getting annihilated, that they pulled the old nothing to see here routine. They kept his death a secret. They buried his internal organs on site. Yes, his heart and guts were interred under a tree while his body was shipped back to Constantinople like a royal Amazon return. Meanwhile, the army fought on, following a dead man's battle plan, winning the siege, and pretending the Sultan was just taking very long naps in his tent. So technically, Suleiman conquered a fortress posthumously. He was too dead to celebrate, but alive enough on paper to still intimidate the enemy. But the best part? The place where his organs were buried became a shrine. People literally made pilgrimages to the spot where his guts were planted. If you ever feel like you haven't left a legacy, just remember, this guy's intestines had fan mail. Suleiman didn't just outlive his enemies, he outlived himself. His legend went on parading around like he was still breathing, conquering stuff and writing poetry, while his actual body was halfway home and his insides were fertilizing a battlefield. Now that's how you exit with style, the queen who died of being too popular, because when everyone loves you, sometimes they literally love you to death. Meet Queen Caroline of Ansbach, wife of King George II of Great Britain. Now, Caroline wasn't just some background royal doing embroidery and fainting on sofas. No. She was smart, sharp, politically savvy, and so well liked that even people who hated the monarchy were like, okay, but Caroline's cool. She basically ran the country whenever her husband was busy yelling at clouds or stomping around palaces in a royal sulk. Parliament liked her. The public adored her. Philosophers wrote fan letters. She was basically the 18th century version of a benevolent influencer, minus the skincare brand. But being the most popular woman in Britain had its downsides, mainly stress. See, while George II spent his days trying to look important, Caroline spent hers doing actual important things, like running foreign policy, negotiating peace, raising 8 children, and keeping her husband from declaring war on random people because he spilled soup on his coat, and all of that kind of broke her body. By the 1730s, Queen Caroline was suffering from a hernia, but because royal medicine back then was about as useful as a band-aid on a cannon wound, her doctors basically just poked around and said, "Try not to sneeze too hard." She kept going anyway. Public appearances, state matters, royal duties. The woman was unstoppable until she wasn't. The hernia turned septic. Her insides quite literally betrayed her. And instead of, actual treatment, doctors decided the best solution was to cut open her abdomen repeatedly in what can only be described as surgery by candlelight and chaos. Spoiler, it didn't work. After days of agony, Caroline died in 1737, and the kingdom lost its mind. People wept in the streets. Poets wrote dramatic odes. Even King George, famous for having all the emotional range of a wet napkin, was devastated. His final words to her were, "No joke, put it down in the books that I loved her." Touching? Sure. Too late? Definitely. So yes, Queen Caroline, the overachieving Queen of Hearts, basically died from being too competent, too beloved, and too overworked by a kingdom that couldn't function without her. Because sometimes, being the backbone of an empire comes with a fatal case of "everyone would be helpless without me" syndrome. The emperor who was buried alive, maybe. Because nothing says eternal rest like a few thousand tons of dirt and 0 exits. Let's raise a suspiciously carved eyebrow at Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China and the human embodiment of, if I can't live forever, no one's allowed to talk about it. This guy wasn't just obsessed with power, he was pathologically into it. He built walls, crushed rebellions, standardized currency, and probably would have invented bureaucracy just to yell at it. But his real passion? Cheating death. Qin Shi Huang was so terrified of dying, he spent most of his reign chasing immortality potions, many of which included ingredients like mercury. The thing that makes thermometers and kills brain cells. Classic. And while his court alchemists were busy poisoning him in the name of eternal youth, Qin was also busy constructing a tomb so massive it made the pyramids that look like starter homes. We're talking underground palaces, rivers of mercury, trap-laden tunnels, and an army of 8,000 terracotta soldiers, all just to say, yeah, I'm still kind of a big deal. But here's the spicy bit. After he died, probably from all that sweet, sweet mercury, his terrified ministers may have buried him before everything was finished. Some historians, even suggest he might have been sealed inside, while parts of it were still under construction. No grand procession, no triumphant final farewell, just oops, the boss is dead, dump him in the megagrave and pretend everything's fine. Why? Well, they were scared. Qin Shi Huang wasn't exactly what you'd call warm and approachable. The guy once buried 460 scholars alive for disagreeing with him. So yeah, when he croaked, his staff probably panicked like kids who broke their dad's favorite car. And since the tomb was rigged with traps, flooding systems, and possibly booby-trapped crossbows set to fire at intruders, nobody's gone inside to confirm what actually happened. It's still sealed, still mysterious, still maybe full of flying death darts. So there you have it, Qin Shi Huang, emperor, tyrant, and possibly the only man in history to accidentally architect his own live burial in the name of immortality. Because if you're going to go out, why not go out inside a radioactive palace, buried under a mountain of do not enter signs, with your soul trapped between paranoia and overkill? The king who was killed by his own monument. Because when your legacy crushes you, that's just fate delivering poetic justice with a granite fist. Let's talk about King Charles VIII of France, aka the guy who tried to strut into Italian glory and ended up getting headbutted by architecture. It's 1498. Charles is still riding the high from invading Italy, poorly, spending lavishly on wars, art, and shoes probably too pointy for safe walking. But the real danger? A door frame? Yes. His final boss battle was a door. Here's what happened. King Chuck was walking through his palace at Amboise, excited to catch a tennis match, because even monarchs need to unwind by watching sweaty nobles lob leather balls at each other. He's strolling along, showing off his kingly swagger, when bam, he walks face first into a stone lintel. Turns out, medieval doors weren't built for 6-foot-tall men with delusions of grandeur. He smacked his royal skull so hard he collapsed instantly. People thought he'd be fine. After all, he was the king. He had doctors, right? Wrong. This was the 15th century, where doctors' idea of treatment was probably to bleed you and hope you leaked the bad vibes out. Charles slipped into a coma and died a few hours later. That's it. The King of France, conqueror of Naples, patron of the arts, royal dreamboat with a questionable jawline, was done in by a doorway. Not assassinated, not poisoned, not taken out in battle, just bonked to death by his own palace. And get this, that palace was practically his own monument, his vanity project, his little slice of architectural heaven that straight up betrayed him with a sneak attack. So let's all remember Charles VIII, the king who dreamed of empires but forgot to duck. The moral of the story? Don't let your ego build something taller than your common sense, or it might just take you out. With style and masonry, the czar who forgot winter always wins, because no matter how many men you command, you're still just a guy with cold toes in Russia. Say hello, then goodbye, to Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, conqueror of most of Europe, and certified overachiever with a tragic allergy to humility. Yes, we're cheating a little here. He wasn't a Russian czar, but he sure tried to out-czar the czars. Spoiler, he did not. It's 1812, and Napoleon, full of revolutionary zeal and hubris the size of his hat collection, decides to invade Russia. Why? Because peace was boring, and apparently he'd run out of nearby countries to ruin. He marches in with the Grande Armée, over 600,000 strong, polished, proud, and ready to teach those Russians a thing or two about manners, French cuisine, and politely surrendering. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. First, the Russians introduced him to a little hospitality tradition called scorched earth, burn everything, starve everyone, and leave behind nothing but ashes and awkward silence. Moscow, torched, supplies, gone, locals, vamoosed. Napoleon arrives in a city full of smoke and disappointment, expecting a grand surrender and getting nothing but frostbite and existential dread. So what does he do? He waits and waits. Winter, meanwhile, doesn't wait for anyone. So let's all remember Charles VIII, the king who dreamed of empires but forgot to duck. The moral of the story? Don't let your ego build something taller than your common sense, or it might just take you out. With style and masonry, the Tsar who forgot winter always wins, because no matter how many men you command, you're still just a guy with cold toes in Russia. Say hello, then goodbye to Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, conqueror of most of Europe, and certified overachiever with a tragic allergy to humility. Yes, we're cheating a little here. He wasn't a Russian czar, but he sure tried to out-czar the czars. Spoiler, he did not. It's 1812, and Napoleon, full of revolutionary zeal and hubris the size of his hat collection, decides to invade Russia. Why? Because peace was boring, and apparently he'd run out of nearby countries to ruin. He marches in with the Grande Armée, over 600,000 strong, polished, proud, and ready to teach those Russians a thing or two about manners, French cuisine, and politely surrendering. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. First, the Russians introduced him to a little hospitality tradition called scorched earth, burn everything, starve everyone, and leave behind nothing but ashes and awkward silence. Moscow, torched, supplies, gone, locals, vamoosed. Napoleon arrives in a city full of smoke and disappointment, expecting a grand surrender and getting nothing but frostbite and existential dread. So what does he do? He waits and waits. Winter, meanwhile, doesn't wait for anyone. Temperatures plummet. Horses freeze mid-May. Men die standing. Boots disintegrate. Soup turns to icicles before it hits the bowl. Napoleon finally realizes Russia doesn't do cozy retreats. It does long, slow death by frost. So the Grande Armée turns around to leave, and that's when things really fall apart. Russian troops chase them. Wolves chase them. Their own mustaches probably turned against them. Napoleon abandons his army and bolts back to Paris on a sleigh, because nothing screams military genius like fleeing winter dressed like a frozen dumpling. When all was said and snowed, fewer than 10% of his army made it back. The rest, claimed by cold, chaos, and one of history's most savage plot twists, climate as a weapon. So yes, this is the tale of the man who could outsmart kings, outfight coalitions, and outdress everyone except winter. Because you can conquer a lot of things, but you can't conquer Russia in November. Ask Napoleon, or what's left of his ego, the pharaoh who took sleeping with the fishes. Literally. Because when your tomb is underwater, you're not buried, you're marinated. Let's talk about Ptolemy XIII, boy king of Egypt, teenage political pawn, and all-around historical footnote who got dunked harder than anyone in pharaonic history. He was technically a pharaoh, yes, but don't imagine some towering gold-plated demigod. Ptolemy XIII was more like that awkward intern who got promoted way too fast. He came to power at the tender age of 11 because Egypt was going through its so let's just give the crown to literally anyone phase. Now here's where it gets splashy. Ptolemy's co-ruler just so happened to be Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra. She was older, smarter, more charismatic, and way better at not dying. The two were supposed to rule together, but Ptolemy, or rather his power-hungry advisors, had other ideas. Cue Civil War, Sibling Edition. When Julius Caesar showed up in Alexandria like, "Hi, I'm Rome," things got spicy. Cleopatra, never one to miss an opportunity, smuggled herself into Caesar's chambers, rolled up in a rug like the world's most seductive burrito. Meanwhile, Ptolemy threw a hissy fit that spiraled into a full-blown siege. Long story short, Caesar wins. Cleopatra's back on top. And Ptolemy? Well, he tries to flee. He jumps into the Nile. He forgets how to swim. Yes. In the grand finale of his royal tantrum, Ptolemy XIII ends up drowning in the Nile, like some ancient blooper reel. A pharaoh, technically divine, brought low by one of the most avoidable deaths in Egyptian history. Not in battle, not by poison, not assassinated in a smoky palace hall, just glub glub. His body, fished out days later, was less regal mummy and more soggy disappointment. No golden tomb, no procession of jackals and incense, just one wet footnote in the annals of royal failures. So let's remember Ptolemy XIII, the boy pharaoh who tried to rule Egypt, challenge Rome, and outmaneuver Cleopatra, and ended up being catfish bait in his own kingdom. Because in the end, the Nile doesn't care who you are. It's undefeated. Now, the emperor who was murdered by modernity. Because when you're a medieval monarch in a machine gun world, the future doesn't knock. It kicks the palace door in. Meet Emperor Meiji's great-grandson, the last emperor of China, Puyi, a man born to rule, in theory. In practice, well, his reign went about as smoothly as a unicycle on a staircase. At the tender age of 2, Puyi became the emperor of the Qing dynasty. Yes, 2. While most toddlers were learning how not to eat bugs, he was technically in charge of 400 million people. He didn't even know how to poop without help, and yet there he sat, on a throne too big and a timeline too late. You see, China was crumbling faster than his potty training. The Qing dynasty was already a hot mess. Rebellions, corruption, foreign powers knocking on the imperial gates like, "Hey, nice country, mind if we carve it up?" By the time little Puyi stopped needing royal diapers, the dynasty was done. Just 3 years into his reign, China went full republic. The Forbidden City? More like the eviction notice city. But Puyi wasn't finished. No. He'd return like a political cockroach, surviving every regime change, coup, and global catastrophe. At one point, the Japanese even installed him as the emperor of Manchukuo, their puppet state in northeast China. He was basically cosplay royalty, dressed up, paraded around, and absolutely powerless. And as modernity slammed into Asia like a bullet train, Puyi was still clinging to his imperial fantasies, like a moth clinging to a light bulb, bright, burning, and very, very doomed. Eventually, after World War II ended and the Japanese were booted out, the Soviets captured him, because of course they did, and he ended up in a Chinese prison, where the once emperor of China spent his days gardening and learning communism. He lived long enough to watch Mao rise, fall, and be painted on lunchboxes. By the end, he was a regular citizen, quietly working as a Beijing botanical researcher. That's right. One day you're the son of heaven, The next, you're trimming bonsai trees for a paycheck. So here lies Puyi, not slain by sword, poisoned by schemers, or toppled in epic battle, but slowly and thoroughly murdered by modernity, one humiliating political shift at a time, because history doesn't always kill you with drama. Sometimes it just updates the system and deletes your throne. The king who was killed by his own propaganda. Because when your image is larger than life, the universe might just say, "Cool story, bro. Now die dramatically." Let's set the scene. Sweden, 1718. The snow is deep, the cannons are loud, and King Charles XII, aka the Lion of the North, is out here trying to reclaim his former glory while looking like a war god carved out of icy vengeance. Charles XII wasn't your average king. The guy basically ghosted royal banquets for most of his life because he was too busy playing real-life Call of Duty across Europe. He was obsessed with being seen as the ultimate warrior king, stoic, invincible, and always on the front lines. You know, just casually treating war like his personal gym membership. He didn't drink, didn't chase women, didn't even laugh, apparently. His entire personality was war and silence, like a Nordic Batman but with more gunpowder and fewer emotional breakthroughs. But here's the kicker. His whole identity was so wrapped up in being bulletproof that people started believing it. Soldiers thought he couldn't die, that he was literally protected by destiny, that even death was like, "Nah, I'll come back later." So in 1718, during the siege of Fredrikstad Fortress in Norway, Charles decides to go inspect the front lines. Again, no helmet, no shield, just his standard issue death wish and an intense stare that probably made horses uncomfortable. And then, bam, he gets shot right between the eyes. Instant death. Game over. Long live the myth. But here's where things get extra spicy. No one knows who did it. Was it a Norwegian sniper? A stray bullet? Or, and this is the fan favorite theory, his own men? Yep. Some believe Charles's troops were so over the constant warfare, famine, and freezing to death for no reason that someone finally said, "Okay, Charles, enough cosplay, time for a permanent nap." Ironically, it was his relentless image as the fearless, invulnerable war machine that may have gotten him killed. He made himself too legendary to not shoot. He was the myth that needed breaking. So let's raise a chilly Nordic toast to Charles XII, the king who died exactly how he lived, surrounded by gunfire, obsessed with glory, and probably still refusing to blink. Because when your whole brand is invincibility, history loves nothing more than to prove you very, very wrong. The Tsar who brought a knife to a revolution. Because nothing says poorly timed optimism like facing a firing squad with royal vibes and zero survival instinct. Gather round for the tragically awkward tale of Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, a man who ruled the largest empire on earth like it was a family-run bakery on the verge of bankruptcy. Kind, polite, indecisive to the point of national collapse, and absolutely not ready for the 20th century, kicking down his palace doors like a drunk Cossack. Nicholas wasn't a bad guy per se. He just had no clue how to run an empire where people wanted food, freedom, and not to die every 5 minutes. While the Russian people were out there freezing, starving, and inventing words for revolution, Nicholas was off writing love letters to his wife and organizing royal yacht parties, like it was still 1850. And then, like a particularly angry thundercloud of history. 1917 happened. The Russian Revolution crashed through the Romanov gates, and Nicholas, bless him, looked genuinely surprised. "Wait, you're mad? About everything?" he might have said, probably while sipping tea and ignoring the sound of pitchforks being sharpened. He abdicated, thinking that would help. Spoiler, it didn't. The Bolsheviks showed up like the world's least friendly moving service, packed up the whole imperial family, and hauled them off to Siberian exile, where the accommodations were less palace and more frozen Airbnb dungeon. But here's the part where history hits peak dark comedy. Nicholas and his family were promised they were being relocated. What actually happened was a brutal execution in a basement at midnight by revolutionaries who had zero chill. And Nicholas? The poor man brought a pocket knife. That's right. In what might be the most painfully symbolic moment of royal delusion, the last Tsar of Russia, once master of armies, builder of railroads, and wearer of absurdly expensive uniforms, entered his final showdown armed like a Victorian Boy Scout. The revolution didn't care. Bullets flew. Jewels sewn into the daughters' corsets deflected some shots. Awkward. But the outcome was inevitable. Monarchy, officially canceled. So here rests Nicholas II, the Tsar who mistook a tidal wave of rebellion for a mild policy disagreement, and who greeted the end of an empire with tragic cluelessness and a tiny, utterly useless blade. Because when history comes for the crown, you'd better bring more than just a butter knife. The Duke who was history's punchline. Because sometimes you're born to greatness, and sometimes you're born to be a cautionary tale, wrapped in a powdered wig. Ladies and gentlemen, meet George IV, the Prince Regent turned King of the United Kingdom. A man so extra, so flamboyantly over the top, that even his portraits look like they're trying not to roll their eyes. George didn't just lean into decadence, he swan dived into it, wearing silk stockings and a feathered hat. This was a guy who spent more money on waistcoats than some countries spent on armies. If there was a diamond he didn't want, it was probably a rock. If there was a meal he didn't finish, it was probably a national emergency. And while Napoleon was out there redrawing the map of Europe with a sword, George was redesigning his living room, again, because the drapes didn't match the imperial vibe. Now, technically, he ruled during a period of big historical events, the Napoleonic Wars, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of Romanticism. But George's biggest battle? His own reputation. Or more specifically, trying to make people forget that he was a walking, talking meme of monarchy. He was mocked by literally everyone. Writers, cartoonists, random guys on the street. No one was safe from roasting George. One satirist called him the fat Adonis of 50, which is both brutally accurate and somehow still too kind. His own subjects hated him so much that when he finally died, the general public reaction was a collective, well, finally. And let's not forget his genius political moves, like secretly marrying a Catholic woman, illegal at the time, and then later marrying Caroline of Brunswick, whom he hated so passionately, he tried to legally unwife her. They met once. It went so badly, he drank himself into a 3-day blackout. Romantic. By the time he became king, his liver was begging for mercy, his subjects were begging for leadership, and George was begging someone, anyone, to appreciate how well he matched his cravat to his curtains. So here lies George IV, a man who wanted to be a legend, but ended up a historical roast session that never ends. He was royalty with the energy of a reality show contestant, fabulous, ridiculous, and just a little too proud of his own reflection. In the end, he didn't rule history. He starred in its blooper reel, Princess Diana, yes, that Diana. The one whose face launched 1,000 tabloid covers, made royal protocol look like a bad suggestion, and turned Buckingham Palace into the most awkward reality show of the century. She started out as a shy nursery school assistant, adorable, sweet, probably smelled like crayons and innocence. Then boom, married to Prince Charles, future king and human embodiment of a beige sofa. The wedding, watched by 750 million people. Her dress had enough fabric to clothe a small country, and just like that, the fairy tale began, and promptly went off the rails. Behind the pearls and palace gates, Diana was drowning in royal coldness, family dysfunction, and the small detail that her husband was very much in love with someone else. Awkward. But instead of fading into the wallpaper like a good royal wife, Diana said, absolutely not. She weaponized charm. She learned how to tilt her head just so in photographs. She turned the press, the people, and the entire planet into her personal fan club. She visited AIDS patients when no one else would touch them. She walked through landmines in high heels. She cried on camera, hugged the sick, and made monarchy look human, which to the royals was basically witchcraft. And while the palace clutched their pearls, Diana was out here making the monarchy relevant, and also deeply uncomfortable. Her divorce from Charles was less of a scandal and more of a mic drop. She walked away from the royal circus and still remained the main act. Then came 1997, that Paris tunnel, the crash, the chaos, and suddenly the world stopped. Her funeral was watched by 2.5 billion people. Grown men wept. The Queen got publicly shamed into flying the flag at half-mast. Elton John rewrote a song for her for crying out loud. Because Diana didn't die a princess, she died a global icon, a legend, a one-woman rebellion wrapped in silk and eyeliner. So here's to the woman who smiled like sunshine and stabbed like truth. She may never have worn the crown, but she owned the story. And long after the palaces crumble and the titles fade, the world will still remember the princess who became more than royal. She became a symbol. The king who lived long enough to see himself become irrelevant. Not all rulers go out in a blaze of glory. Some just fade politely into historical obsolescence while the world speeds right past them. At first, Franz Joseph I was the full package. Emperor at 18, regal side part, military discipline, and a moral code so stiff it could have marched on its own. When he took the throne in 1848, revolution was literally on fire across Europe, and Franz Joseph responded the only way he knew how, with uniforms, decrees, and an expression that suggested he hadn't smiled since the womb. And to his credit, he hung on. For 68 long, mustache-filled years, he was the human duct tape holding together the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a chaotic blend of languages, cultures, and people who all fundamentally agreed on one thing. They didn't want to be part of his empire. Franz Joseph was the guy history kept forgetting to fire. He outlasted Napoleon III, Bismarck, Queen Victoria, and several versions of the light bulb. While the rest of Europe was racing into the modern age, Franz was still signing edicts with a quill and acting like telephones were a passing fad. Entire ideologies rose and fell while he carefully reviewed cavalry uniform regulations. In his personal life, pure melodrama. His wife, Empress Sisi, was a part-time empress and full-time runaway with a gym addiction. His son, Crown Prince Rudolph, was found dead in a tragic scandal at Meyerling that historians still whisper about, like it's a true crime podcast. His heir, Franz Ferdinand, was so unlikable that his assassination still managed to cause World War I. But Franz Joseph? He kept going. He watched his empire rot from the inside while showing up to every ceremony like an extremely punctual ghost. He was the royal equivalent of Internet Explorer, old, slow, and somehow still installed on your system. By the time he finally died in 1916, the empire was already cracking like a poorly baked strudel. 2 years later, it was gone. Poof. Deleted from the map, no dramatic fall, just an awkward shrug from history and a we're going in a different direction. So here's to Franz Joseph I, the king who stayed too long at the party, never changed the playlist, and eventually found himself standing alone in a ballroom no one else wanted to be in. History didn't overthrow him. It simply moved on. The emperor who was erased. Because what's worse than dying in disgrace? Dying in disgrace and then getting photoshopped out of history like you were never invited in the first place. Meet Emperor Nero II. Just kidding, that's not his real name. Because we're talking about Emperor Elagabalus, the Roman emperor so scandalous, so gloriously chaotic, that after his death, Rome didn't just bury him, they basically hit delete on his entire existence. Let's start with the basics. Elagabalus became emperor at just 14 years old, which is roughly the age most people are still figuring out deodorant. But young Elagabalus didn't waste time with silly things like competency or public approval. Nope. He came in hot with a plan to turn the Roman Empire into a reality show called Keeping Up with the Gods I just invented. He was obsessed with a Syrian sun god called Elagabal and naturally decided that everyone in Rome should be too. So he built a massive temple, threw traditional Roman religion out the window, and tried to marry his god to a Roman goddess in what can only be described as divine fan fiction. Also, the man loved drama. He wore makeup, dressed in women's clothes, and was rumored to have offered vast sums of money to any doctor who could perform gender-affirming surgery in 3rd century Rome. That's right. While the Senate was still stuck in togas and toxic masculinity, Elagabalus was inventing gender fluidity, scandalizing the elite, and making everyone in the forum gasp into their olives. And the marriages? Oh, the marriages. He allegedly had 5 wives, a male lover named Heracles, who he called his husband, and possibly proposed marrying the god he worshipped. At some point, even Caligula would have said, okay, maybe tone it down. Rome was not ready. The Senate hated him. The Praetorian Guard hated him. His grandmother, who had helped put him on the throne, really hated him. Eventually, the army solved the Elagabalus problem the old-fashioned way: assassination, followed by throwing his body in the Tiber River like yesterday's leftovers. But Rome wasn't done. They went full cancel culture. His portraits smashed, his statues destroyed, his name scrubbed from official records. They declared a damnatio memoriae, which is Latin for you don't go here anymore. He didn't just lose power, he was erased. So here lies Elagabalus, flamboyant, outrageous, possibly ahead of his time, and definitely too spicy for Rome's bland palate. He ruled for just 4 wild years, but left behind a legacy so controversial that the empire tried to pretend he never existed. Too bad, Rome. History remembered him anyway. And honestly, he stole the show. The queen who outlived her enemies, and then some, because when life gives you assassination plots, excommunications, and enemies with armies, you just slap on a red wig, throw shade and iambic pentameter, and live long enough to attend your enemies' funerals, in pearls. Welcome to the never-ending reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the Tudor firecracker who turned survival into a national sport and England into her personal drama stage. She was born the oops child of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, a woman famously executed by her husband because, well, he got bored and had trust issues with a side of decapitation. Elizabeth wasn't even supposed to exist politically. She was declared illegitimate, tossed aside, and politely ignored until her half-siblings started dying or imploding, and suddenly, boom, crown. And then, the real chaos started. There were assassination attempts, conspiracies, Catholic uprisings. The Pope literally excommunicated her, which was the 16th century version of being banned from the group chat and cursed by the admin. Oh, and Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, her rival, and the ultimate royal frenemy. Mary spent decades trying to steal Elizabeth's crown, her throne, and probably her eyeliner routine. Elizabeth kept her locked up for 19 years, like a very classy hostage situation, before finally signing her death warrant, with flair. She faced the Spanish Armada, which was less a fleet and more a floating hate letter from Catholic Europe. But England, under her command, defeated them with a mix of luck, weather, and sheer Elizabethan sass. And while her enemies dropped like flies, stabbed, beheaded, exiled, or just very, very disappointed, Elizabeth kept glowing, refused to marry, refused to share power, and referred to herself as the Virgin Queen, which was great branding and even better PR. She turned herself into a living myth, powdered face, flaming hair, speeches that made grown men cry and or kneel, and a wardrobe that could kill a man with a collar. By the time she died in 1603, after 44 years on the throne, she had outlasted every enemy, pretender, and disapproving priest. The woman basically ran England like a solo act in a Shakespearean epic. And when they buried her, they did it with full pomp and enough symbolism to choke a historian. Because Elizabeth didn't just survive, she endured, she became legend, and then she took her enemies' legacies with her. Mike, Drop, Majesty, the prince who never got his fairy tale. Because not every royal ends up with a glass slipper and a happy ending. Some just get royal drama, heartbreak, and a one-way ticket to exile, served with a side of shattered destiny. Let's talk about Prince Karl of Sweden, better known as Prince Karl, Duke of Östergötland, a royal who had the title, the charm, the cheekbones, and even the romantic spirit, but absolutely none of the plot armor. He was the classic prince type, handsome, well-mannered, spoke like 6 languages, probably good with dogs and babies. You get the idea. A total catch if you ignore the part where his love life exploded like a poorly written soap opera. Now here's where it gets juicy. Karl fell madly in love with a woman who was not of royal blood, a commoner, and not just any commoner, a ballet dancer, scandalous, Shakespearean, basically a royal death sentence in a family photo. He begged to marry her, pleaded, promised he'd give up his place in the line of succession. He was like, "I just want love and maybe a small villa. Is that so wrong?" The royal family responded with a hard LOL no, and told him to pick a princess or pack his bags. Karl, being stubborn and romantic, and maybe slightly allergic to good decisions, chose love. He renounced his title, left Sweden, and married the woman of his dreams. Cue applause, right? Except no one clapped. The marriage didn't exactly sparkle. Exile wasn't as glamorous as it looked in the fairy tales. The crown was gone, the titles were gone, and the storybook ending turned into a quiet life in obscurity. No throne, no kingdom, no happy ever after montage. Meanwhile, back in Sweden, the monarchy moved on like he was a footnote, a royal ghost. The prince who once might have ruled, now just a trivia question no one gets right. So here lies Prince Carl, not literally, don't be dramatic, just metaphorically curled up in the dusty corners of royal history. No tragic death, no grand betrayal, just a man who traded a crown for a kiss and learned that fairy tales don't always come with a decent epilogue. Sometimes the pumpkin doesn't turn into a carriage. Sometimes it just stays a pumpkin. The king who inherited an ancient title. Too late because nothing says better late than never, quite like getting handed a crown when everyone else has already forgotten why you wanted it in the first place. Meet King Alfonso XIII of Spain, a guy who technically became king the second he was born. That's right, zero waiting around, but didn't actually get to do much ruling until he grew up, which, spoiler alert, didn't exactly go smoothly. Here's the catch. Alfonso inherited a throne with the charisma of a soggy tortilla. Spain was already a mess of political chaos, colonial hangovers, and more coups than a breakfast buffet. The ancient title he inherited carried centuries of tradition and power, except the world had moved on while he was busy being a baby in a cradle. When Alfonso finally took the reins, the kingdom was like a vintage car stuck in mud. Classic, sure, but impossible to get moving. Political factions fought like cats in a yarn store, and every move Alfonso made was second-guessed by people who'd rather be anywhere else but tangled up in royal drama. He tried to be the modern monarch, attending to duties and styling his mustache with care, but the timing was tragic. World War I raged on. Spain stayed neutral, because why pick sides when you can watch the circus? And internally, the country was simmering with unrest that would eventually boil over. And then came the Spanish Civil War, the ultimate, oops, maybe this ancient title isn't worth it moment. Alfonso's reign ended in exile when the monarchy was abolished, proving that sometimes inheriting power too late means you're just a cameo in history's messy reboot. So while his ancestors strutted around Europe with swords and golden scepters, Alfonso XIII inherited a title shadowed by past glories, present chaos, and a future that said, thanks, but no thanks. He's the king who got the crown, just not the kingdom. And sometimes, that's the real royal tragedy. So what's the takeaway from our royal highlight reel of oops, I died in the most ridiculous way possible? Whether it's suffocating in a wooden box, getting dunked in your own bathtub, losing a fight to a monkey, or just getting politely erased from history like a bad Tinder date, death doesn't care if you're crowned or common. Power, prestige, and all your fancy titles? Yeah, they don't mean squat when the Grim Reaper's got his eyes on you. History's got a twisted sense of humor, and the real lesson here is, no matter how epic your reign, your exit is probably going to be the joke everyone remembers. You can either be the punchline or the one laughing last. Your call. So next time you're feeling untouchable, just remember, every king, queen, emperor, and Sultan has their wait what moment before the credits roll. Maybe hold off on that extra cream bun, watch your back around furniture, and for heaven's sake, don't challenge any monkeys. Because in the end, royal or not, everyone's death story is just history's way of throwing shade. And honestly, that's kind of majestic.